Okay.
Hey,
We're live.
we're live.
Chris Anderson, welcome.
Welcome. Greetings from London.
From London. Greetings from London. Greetings from Chicago. The broadcast studios are up and on the air. Signals winging their way across the globe. It's very exciting. And we oh, look, there's viewers. Thank God again. We so appreciate that. Oh, and I keep posting the same comment over and over. Hey, Eric, good to see you. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes here. Not a couple of minutes, but a few seconds to get everybody up. Please say hello. Bob, good to see you. From Wisconsin. It's the state north of Illinois.
I think he gets that a lot.
Yeah, and Robert Fry from a state south of Illinois.
So, Bob, do people from Illinois really bother you, or is,
Tom and Emily, how are you guys doing?
Illinois? All right.
I guess we've got a few more people. Oh, George Luz. Did you know George Luz? Have I introduced you guys?
No, I never heard of him before.
Okay. We have lots of great people joining us again, and thank you to everybody who's coming on. And Chris, we can't actually start the show without playing the now legendary History Happy Hour.
Absolutely.
Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, here you go. It's now official. We're now officially up and on the air. The bar is open. Do you have your cocktail? And of course, we're here every Sunday at 4 p.m., whether you like it or not. So we're glad that you're here with us. And I just want to remind everybody, if you want to email us at any point, hhh@StephenAMbroseTours.com. Chris, before we are joined by our guest today, John Langellier, we were talking the other day, and you raised an interesting topic that I thought it would be great to ask people about. How's your mind working? Do you remember what that topic was?
I wanted to maybe ask our viewers what their favorite story involving alcohol and history was, because much like this show, history itself is propelled by alcohol. So if there's a favorite story or anecdote our viewers have about,
throw that up on the. You can throw that up on the comments page, and we'll either get to maybe looking at a few of them later in the show, or possibly devote another entire show to that topic if you can give us enough good stuff. Chris, I found a story in this fabulous little book here, which I'll just show you. Which incidentally I wrote.
Oh, right.
Yes, but did you know that the Pilgrims had a really bad aim? They were aiming for Virginia. They hit Massachusetts, and they would have probably gone down the coast to look for Virginia and try to find it, except they were running out of something. And one Pilgrim's Journal explains, "We could not take time for further search or consideration, our victuals being much spent, especially our beer."
Okay.
So the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts because of beer, or as I like to say, they made port because they ran out of beer.
Oh, that's good.
All right. So, and we have other people joining us and perhaps adding some stories as well. Just throw them up on the comments page on the side. Hey, so why don't you introduce our guest? We've been making him wait. He may be asleep by now for all I know, but we're hoping that he's still kind of awake. And why don't you, he's grabbing for his glass there. Why don't you give him an introduction?
Well, I am thrilled to death to invite Dr. John Langellier on the show. John is an old and dear friend and a outstanding historian of the West. He's written so many books that if I used them on my seat, I would stand like this.
Ooh, all right. So which is very practical, by the way.
Thank you. But just a funny anecdote about John. Many years ago, I was just starting out assistant historian at the Historical Society of the Militia and National Guard. And I was in my office one day, and a book came in that John had written, and I read it, and I wrote back to him with some very unkind comments now. And unlike most people, John didn't tell me, as he should have, to go to hell. Worse, he said, "Okay, smartass, you write a book." And he got me my first writing contract. So a lot of what I became, or am becoming, I guess, is down to John. So I've always
blame on John. Yes.
Yes. Been always very grateful about that. So thank you, John.
Well, actually, your words were some of the kindest I've ever gotten about my books. So.
We asked Andrew Roberts last week about one of his books, and he said he thought he had personally met everyone who had read that book. So
yes. My books are so popular that they're remaindered before they come off the press. It just tells you the problems. So I don't have a story for you, but I do have a toast from Lord Alfred Peacock, sorry. Not drunk with he who from the floor can rise again and drink some more. Toast, gentlemen.
Here's to that. Let's drink some more.
Now,
Chris, do you want to start off the questioning here?
Sure. Well, I mean, as some of our guests might know, our topic this week is Crazy Horse and Custer and the Plains Wars. And we're very excited about that because we wanted to demonstrate to people that we are interested in things beyond the Second World War. And it's a topic that, like most little boys in America, became fascinated by. And I know a lot more probably of the myth of Custer and the Little Bighorn and Crazy Horse than I do about the reality. So I wanted to kind of bring John here to maybe fill in some of the real details about kind of one of these important events that everybody knows about, but probably doesn't know very much about really. John, I mean, one of the questions I'll start off with, this is from one of our viewers, Paul. He had mentioned that, we all have a perception of what happened at the Little Bighorn. And in 1983, there was a big fire, which burned down a lot of grass, which led to a lot of archaeology, which kind of changed how we view the battle. And so maybe using that as a segue into talking about some of the myths and the realities of what happened.
In theory, as the ground doesn't lie. I mean, those of us who are trained in archaeology claim that we can bring truths from the ground, but we all bring, obviously, baggage, whatever we're looking at. But truly, that was a monumental time, everything from forensics to finding some of the unburied dead on the battlefield and some reconstructions, to the ballistics, which were brilliantly done by Doug Scott, particularly, and Richard Fox, both excellent historians and archaeologists. And it did one thing, I think, if nothing else, it still didn't enlighten us on what actually happened there. Because as the old cartoon used to say, was you there? Well, none of them were. And those who were didn't speak English who survived, and those who did speak English didn't survive. So it's kind of a problem of culture and language. But we do know that probably the very tightly knit situation that many of us as modern historians look at is unit cohesion. Obviously, that was something that was a major issue that tends to demonstrate the lack of unit cohesion and the loss of command and control that ultimately led perhaps to the demise of Custer and his immediate command. But as Benteen, not one of his favorite officers in the regiment, said, and I think put it most succinctly, was, we were at their hearth and home. These guys were, quote, professional soldiers, which is questionable in a lot of cases of these new recruits, whereas the other people were part-time soldiers who were there defending everything that was dear and near to them. And so you're going to probably fight in a different way than you do when the home front is well behind you. And so I think that particular situation, Glenn Swanson, a good friend of mine who passed a few years ago, did a wonderful hardbound book, almost a virtual tour of Custer and his times in Little Bighorn. And two of the areas that were covered particularly were things by Doug Scott, and to a certain degree based on some of the work that on the archaeology has been published. And I would recommend anybody who has any real interest to start backwards. There's, these bookshelves behind me could go from floor to ceiling, and they could all be related to Custer and Little Bighorn. Thank goodness they aren't. maybe that I do have in real life. But having said that, I would recommend Googling Richard Fox and Doug Scott and getting some of their work as a point of departure. And actually, after we're through today, I'll send you guys some references that I know that you.
Oh, great! Yeah, we'll post those on the website.
Because I know periodically when you're sober that you do things. So, however, I've never seen you that way, but it'll ultimately happen, I'm sure.
Well, it'll happen, yeah.
I was out at the Rock Island Armory a few months ago, and they have their 5 actually, rifles that they've matched up the rifle with the cartridge, I guess, so that they know where these rifles were fired from, and they, I think, were primarily fired by the Native Americans.
Precisely. Those were the captive weapons, you're correct. Doug did a lot of the work on the ballistics, and it's not unlike the ballistics. Well, it's based on exactly the same ballistics we would have in court for a murder trial or what have you. And not only did Doug do the work, but my colleague Glenn was so impassioned. He went out and bought one of these compound microscopes, spent time and made resin castings of each of the recovered spent cartridges, and they knew exactly because of the precision of where they were found, etc. And he spent years of his life having people in the general world say, "Here's a spent cartridge from my carbine or my rifle or whatever it was, and does it match any of the known?" Well, most of the time it didn't. But Glenn probably had about a half a dozen of the other ones that weren't in the museum at Rock Island that were ballistically tested, including one that possibly was trumpeter John Martin's Martini, Italians, probably his carbine, which is pretty extraordinary when you can get down to that reality of the history that you can literally hold in your hands.
John, going back to this encounter, what we used to call Custer's Last Stand when I was a kid, but I think we call the Battle of Little Bighorn now. What is the U.S. Army, of which General Custer's 7th Cavalry is only a part, what are they doing in the summer of 1876 out in the Montana, Wyoming area? And why does this encounter loom so large in the American history that I learned in school?
It's a good question. It obviously came from you and not Chris. I will answer.
He's brutal. He's brutal.
Hey, I didn't get back at him for that first pen. I've been holding it in now for 40 years. So
I thought he made by bringing you on the show. I thought he made up for that whole book thing.
No, I can never make it up.
He's embarrassed me. We'll talk offline why I shouldn't be doing this. But no, it is a great question. And years earlier than your question. Texas is the big hotbed in about 1874. We have the Comanches, the Kiowa, and others. And we have this fellow by the name of Phil Sheridan, who's my hero because he and I literally could see eye to eye at 5'4". And as a result, Sheridan launches this multi-column, 4 columns under Mackenzie and others. Ronald Mackenzie, a really incredibly complex officer, perhaps the best in the Trans-Mississippi West post-Civil War. And they bring to bear finally enough pressure that the Comanche Wars, etc., end with the other groups. And Texas is as settled as it's ever going to get. That's a whole other problem, but it's because it's Texas. And so what are you going to do? Flash forward about a little over a year, and Sheridan now is saying we have the same situation in his military mind to a certain degree. We need to take care of, despite the Treaty of 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty, which says till the grass grows and as long as it grows and the streams flow, etc. This land is the land for these people, the Lakota and the Cheyenne, the Cheyenne, the people we know as the Sioux and others. Well, there's a number of problems. The railroad wants to go through. They need land for one of the new transcontinental railroads. Obviously, Custer goes out with the expedition into the Black Hills, and there's supposedly gold to the grassroots, and so there's wealth to be had. So, well, we really didn't mean that treaty. So here our friend Sheridan and others say, well, then you guys all have to get back on the reservation. Well, wait a minute. You said this is a place we could all live and live out our lifestyle, hunt the buffalo and carry on our religious rites, etc. And so by 75, we have, and early into now into 76, an ultimatum has been made. You guys all have to get back home on the reservation in January of 76. Well, that doesn't happen. Just like people don't wear masks during this time period and they go out and violate all the things that are going on. And by the way, this distancing, you're in Chicago, you're in London, and I'm in Arizona. I mean, you guys have carried this to the far extreme, but that's all right. You're experienced anyway, and I've known that.
It looks like you're wearing your mask right now on your shirt there.
It's Custer was known to wear an arrow shirt, which I'm wearing here. The arrows are in the back. And he always had this scarlet scarf type of thing that Eileen this morning took a pair of my underwear and made it into the same scarf for me. So I'm very grateful. But having said that, to answer your question, the Army is following through the national challenge of we're going to make a change in the West. We're going to renege on the treaty. We're doing this on behalf of the government and political pressures and economic pressures. And so people like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse are saying, no, we told you this was not going to happen. We have a way of life that you have committed to supporting, and you're not doing it. We're not coming in from the reservation. And so once again, Phil Sheridan says, well, I'll set up this multi-column situation, and we'll send George Crook out and Gibbon and all these other people to go and crush in this pincer movement these people who are in our idea, the hostiles who must come back onto the reservation. And Custer is essentially at one point being looked at as possibly leading one of these columns, but he gets in bad odor with a fellow by the name of Grant, who happens to be the president and has a very different perspective on how things are done militarily and politically than George Custer does, who happened to be at the bottom of his class at West Point, whereas Grant was not, etc. And Grant's administration has been attacked personally by Custer and some of his relatives. Now, Grant is one of those people, as we all know, perhaps one of the most honest men ever to sit in the presidency, but he doesn't necessarily surround himself by like-minded people. So in some respects, Custer has done the right thing. He's blowing the whistle, but not in a way that perhaps is going to be good for his career. And finally, through things of Sheridan and others, they say, this guy's a field commander. He's not a politician. He's not great in peacetime, but in war, he is absolutely ambitious and fearless, and so we must have him in the column. So these three columns are going to converge on finding the Indians who are out there that must be brought back in. But for any of you who have been to places like Wyoming and Montana, like Yakir has, and Yakir never wants to go back again because he's had to spend a week with me, our colleague who's the president of Stephen AMbrose Tours, you could get lost today with a Google map, much less not knowing where you are and not knowing where, more importantly, the people you're seeking out are, all these individuals who refuse to come onto the reservation. So this is what's happening during the so-called Centennial Campaign of 1876, Centennial being our country's 100 years old, and everybody's celebrating how wonderful things are, except those who are being hunted by a large portion of perhaps some of the best and the brightest in the U.S. Army at that time.
I'm always struck by, before you can jump in with a question, Chris, right, but I'm always struck by the fact that the Battle of Little Bighorn takes place, I think it's June 25th, 1876, and virtually simultaneously, Alexander Graham Bell is demonstrating the telephone at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And so you have this kind of, the old and the new that are happening simultaneously. It is definitely a time of change.
Couldn't you imagine Custer having a phone calling Benteen in Reno? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? The carbine ammunition.
He just could have done something on Facebook where he tagged himself where he was, and
that's right. But these guys didn't do it, and that's the thing. Again, if you go to that battlefield today, it's just extraordinary. You can't even hear sound traveling in certain areas unless the conditions are right. And so you're in this area that's full of rabbit warrens of these coulees, these ravines, these hills, a substantial river there, and it's amazing. So you, while not making excuses, without all the modern appurtenances of the battlefield today, the fog of war was more than a fog. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face.
So, John, one of the things I've always been curious about is I understand Custer's appeal to his men. I understand he was a darling of the press. I get all that. But one of the things I haven't understood is how officers like Sheridan, Sherman, and some other, I would say, more competent or more professional officers kind of allowed him to get as far as he got.
Well,
and I was curious about your thoughts on that. Or am I being too harsh on Custer?
As we all know, probably the one biography of Custer, which tends to be fairly friendly, is of course Bob Utley's Cavalier and Buckskin. But more recently, T.J. Stiles has talked about Custer, and what we often forget, including yours truly, is, because I always say that's the kind of guy we would have fragged in Nam, but it's not true. If you look at his Civil War record, he has a competent Civil War record. He is ambitious and he is aggressive, but he's not reckless. He's not foolhardy. And indeed, one of the first battles he's in, he dismounts his troops and they form a skirmish line, and they don't go crazy like they died with their boots on with the saber in hand, charging into the Confederate lines, but they use the firepower of their Spencer's carbines, which is an excellent weapon compared to the much of the single shot. And so he wins battles. And indeed, when he eventually goes through his various folks, because he's smart, he knows patronage is important. It's the old, not what you know, who you know. And when you graduate at the bottom of your class, you may not be stupid. You just might be lazy. The frat brother that we all remembered getting just barely the pass because he studied the night before. Well, Custer was somewhat like that, but he was not a stupid individual. And he understood tactics. And he sometimes understood how to disobey an order that was tactically unsound and could cost the life of his men. As it goes from being McClellan's protege to Alfred Pleasanton's proteges to ultimately coming on board with Sheridan, who's an infantry officer, not a cavalry officer. Sheridan somewhat admires this guy's bravado and his ability to take down people literally with a saber, if need be, face to face in a time in the leadership from the front, as opposed to leadership back in the bunker making these decisions at long distance. And so they saw what the man had, and they knew that he had issues, and obviously those issues in peacetime, and Chris probably is more can appreciate this than anybody, and I know it's dangerous to make these analogies, but let's face it, if you went to war, you probably might want to go to war with a George Patton, but you probably don't want to be in an occupation post-war situation with a George Patton as much as you would have going into the Bulge. And Custer's that kind of guy. We need those kind of officers who are willing to put themselves forward, who the men, at least during the Civil War, adore. By the time Custer goes to Texas, all bets are off. They haven't seen the Custer that his men in the Michigan brigades and stuff had seen. They see this hard-ass guy that's always enforcing the rules, who's racist, who's feathering his own nest in their own minds and doing things. And so the 7th Cavalry, to the most part, and certainly the folks in Texas during occupation, don't see Custer of the war. But Sheridan does. Sherman does. Grant never sees him mano a mano as much as obviously Sheridan does, because he's at a much higher level of command. But he has come to respect Sheridan and Sherman in a way that none of us can really imagine unless we've been in that same situation and you're the guy in the next to the foxhole suite type of thing. And as a consequence, he relies, meaning Grant, on allowing these guys to know that this guy's a flawed. He's hubris. He's a classic Greek kind of tragic figure in a way, but he's a brave tragic figure who at West Point was full of pranks. And T.J. Stiles says this. He says that at West Point, Custer was more interested in impressing his classmates and his fellow cadets than he was the cadre. He wasn't concerned about the higher authority. He wanted to be a soldier and be liked and respected amongst those guys. And so here's this brash kind of kid who's coming from nothing and coming from the wrong political party at one point in life and such. And here's George Custer really wanting to please, and he does please fellow officers. He is, in many respects, a soldier, as long as you have somebody over him to control him. And supposedly that's what Terry is there to do. And Gibbons, remember, is he's getting ready to go forward, and he leads off the main column that he's with. And they say, hey, leave something for us, George. Don't get out there and attack without us and take all the glory. And he essentially answers, no, I won't? Does he mean, no, I won't take all the glory, or no, I won't listen to you, I'm going to take the glory? To this day, we'll never know what he meant there. But he's the kind of guy that could be a loose cannon, or he could be the most competent subordinate. And as an old naval officer who was my commanding officer when I was with the Civil Engineer Corps used to say, whatever pleases my commanding officer interests the hell out of me. And Custer sometimes did please his commanding officer in a way that interested the hell out of his COs. So there you have it.
John, can we're talking, I should say, with historian John Langellier on History Happy Hour on the Stephen AMbrose Facebook and YouTube pages. And if you have any questions, please feel free to post them up in our comments. John, we've been talking about Custer the man, and we just saw him there as a very young man. And let's talk about Custer the myth and how that myth gets started, what role his wife plays, and kind of where it goes, because it seems to me that the myth outruns the man by quite a bit.
I would reckon that many of our viewers, including myself, started out with Custer the myth because of the power of modern media. But the power of the media in Custer's lifetime, the illustrated magazines, Wad, Alfred Wad, and others, and these, Harper's Weekly and things, helped this guy is handsome, he's dashing, he's brave, he's starting to win battles. And as we all know, during the beginning of the Civil War, with McClellan having the slows and whatever, the Union wasn't looking that, shall we say, the kind of horse you'd want to back. So that myth is important. And you were talking about his wife, Libby, which she was absolutely,
nice hat.
Isn't that great? This woman, if you looked at her in the early days, she was absolutely extraordinarily beautiful. She was savvy. She was from a political background. As the old saying goes, behind every successful man is an astonished woman. And in this case, she helped make George Custer, not only during his lifetime, where she was helping pull strings during the time that the Civil War, she was in Washington lobbying and with senators and all these people and meeting Lincoln and things. But when Custer dies, she becomes the professional Victorian widow. And she writes these incredibly empowered books. I mean, she's a great writer. She can express herself. So here she's a mini industry turning out these books that are lauding her husband, who has died for the sins of the nation and who's helped westward expansion go across and manifest destiny, make its way across the plains to the Pacific, and these sort of things. And these books are powerful. She's a powerful speaker. She's a demure figure. And there's one thing that's going for her, actually two. Number one, Victorian gentlemen will not speak ill of the dead while the widow is still around. It's just not like today's press where whatever piece of garbage you get, you might want to put out there immediately. Number two, she outlasts them all. And so she has essentially for a generation or more the final word on George Custer. So this is picked up by everything from walking into the saloon and seeing an Anheuser-Busch huge image of the Custer's last stand, with guys carrying Zulu shields and Asenjis and things because they didn't have the right stuff to portray the Plains Indians, to literally legions of these paintings like this one by Paxson that's in the magnificent Buffalo Bills Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming, where it's the historic, it's beautiful. They have flags flying, although there's no flags at the battle. And George Custer is there in the middle of it all, even though George might have died even before the actual combat started, according to some of the Lakota and Indian oral histories and things. But it becomes huge in art. It becomes huge in books. Buffalo Bill, who's the quintessential showman creating a West, perhaps it never was, even though he had actually been there, has that as one of his centerpieces, the Custer's valiant last stand. And this whole myth of the last stand, the 300 Spartans at the pass, becomes this amazing thing that every school kid knows about. And then enter Hollywood. And in the silent era from 1909 forward till the quintessential, they died with their boots on, with a guy from Tasmania playing Custer. At the end, Errol Flynn was saber in hand, ready to be cut down by of course, Crazy Horse, who's played by our friend Anthony Quinn, who's very much a Lakota, as we all know, is there standing for Christian right and the American might, and how he dies as a martyr for the cause. Well, you flash forward to our generation, well, not yours because you're young, Rick, but old guys like me remember you're going to see Little Big Man, and our friend, Little Big Man says to him, "You're crazy, General. If you go down there, all the Indians in the world are going to kill you." Well, that is indeed what happens, and Custer is now a spoof on all that is bad about America and its imperialism and what's going on or has happened in Vietnam, and Penn's writings are very much that way. And so Custer is literally a man for all seasons. You can change him to wherever you want the myth, and perhaps one of the reasons you can do that, besides of all the appurtenances of how the myth can begin, is we really don't know, to come to the top of the hour in your question, Rick, really what did happen, despite all our efforts to do so. And so it's like an Agatha Christie situation where it's a mystery, and you can have who done it, and whatever the plot you want to have, and whatever the motive, you can change with every time because it fits. And until probably at least into the 1990s, Custer you could find in numerous forms of continued in literature and television and motion picture, that ill-fated Custer during Vietnam, Wayne Maunder wanted to make love rather than war kind of guy with long hair, and he was kind of a hippie Custer. You could create Custer to be anything you wanted. And I think that's one of the enduring situations of why he lasted so long. The myth was more powerful than the reality. And the old John Ford, situation from the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. This is the West, sir, when the legend becomes back. Print the legend.
Print the legend. Absolutely.
So, John, since Custer wasn't the only officer out there.
What?
Well, I mean, again, it's interesting to me, living in London and talking to people my age or your age, even here in London, if you mention American military history, within 2 minutes, even the British will say, "Oh yeah, the Little Bighorn," or they have an interest in it, or they've heard stories about it. And one of the things that I often come back with is there was a lot more going on out there, and there was a big army, and he wasn't the only officer in it. So are there any other, looking at, I know it's a big span of time, but looking at the Indian campaigns or the Indian wars, are there officers that you see as being really outstanding in their field, and how did they develop, and how did they kind of learn that type of fighting? Because they come from the Civil War, of course, which is a very different type of war.
Most of the senior officers, not all, but many of them come, like Custer, class of 1861 from West Point. So they've been trained in the classical stand-up Napoleonic, this is the way people fight, and we're going to fight another European enemy. And so there's no counterinsurgency classes, and there's none of that going on. As a matter of fact, there's really nothing until more modern times in the curriculum. Your point is a good one. Whether you were in London or whether you were in Tokyo or whether you're in Paris, you could list off people like George Crook or Noel Mackenzie, you could Alfred Terry, all these officers who were, John Reynolds, all these officers of the Civil War, and would get the deer in the headlight. But you say George Custer, and everybody has an opinion. They may not be absolutely even remotely close, but they will recognize the name. So that is that power of that myth. Mackenzie, as I've raised many times, was one of the finest officers in the U.S. Army. He understood the types of work that had to be done to get into the field and to bring that war to the hearth and home, that total war that, of course, Sherman in his urban renewal efforts in Georgia had started in many respects. But why did they blame him for that? There were some bad neighborhoods. I mean, whatever. Having said
well, there
that,
goes our audience south of New York City. We didn't really need those folks
right.
Thanks, guys.
And just as there were fine officers during the war. I mean, obviously, everybody lauds Robert E. Lee, good, bad, or the indifferently, or people like Longstreet, and certainly Jeb Stuart, the other side of the coin of a George Custer, if you will, is a brave cavalryman who had charisma, and he would follow his, feather anywhere type of thing. Well, in the case of these other officers, they have been overshadowed by the myth, but I would recommend that Bad Hand Mackenzie is somebody to look at, and he dies tragically. He's essentially would be today institutionalized, and was in many respects. Why? Who knows what causes that? So you have these brilliant leaders. George Crook goes back and forth. George Crook, really at the Rosebud, is not his finest day. He fights to a standstill. He does all the right things. His command isn't wiped out, but he turns around and goes home. Well, I gave at the office. I'm leaving now. Well, if Crook had just even told people what he had known and what he'd found, maybe there would have never been a Little Bighorn. Maybe we would have never been having this discussion, because he didn't share some of that intelligence. And yes, it's more difficult to get things into the field, but it's not impossible. And so all those people he faced, or most of them, are going to be back at Little Bighorn with a vengeance and know these guys are on their tail. So Crook in his finest hour does better in Arizona with the scouts and understanding his saying, in order to polish a diamond, you need diamond dust. Well, in his case, he uses brilliantly Indian scouts, particularly other Apaches, against the Apaches. But even then, he does this typical thing. What's he do after Rosebud? He goes out and hunts and fish. I mean, I'm sure that's exactly what Eisenhower wanted to do on June 9th. I think I'll go out and shoot a round of golf and maybe, go out with Winston and bag some grouse, No, I don't think so. So, there are these officers. They are perhaps more brilliant, more professional, whatever that means, because the Army is one of the first really nationally professional institution. It's not just a school for engineers when they go to West Point. And even guys like Miles is tenacious. After all this is over, he spends the winter out. Hey, this isn't cricket. You guys are hunting us don't you know you don't hunt us in the winter? It's cold. We're in our teepees. We're eating our, whatever's left over of the buffalo meat from last year and things. And you're chasing us down. Now, that's really pretty mean-spirited of you. Well, so here's this unprofessional guy who would be like, a big box store manager before the war, Civil War, that means. And now he's out in the field and ultimately will, for better or for worse, take credit, if not the reality, of helping in the literally generations of violence in Arizona. The Apache Wars make the Plains Indian Wars look like a hiccup. These have been going on since the Spanish colonial times, where,
right.
Until we moved the Lakota out from Minnesota because they didn't like the fish or something, and came to the plains and pushed pressure on other tribal people who, by the way, like the Shoshones, who fought valiantly during the Rosebud situation, which we'll come back to at the end. I think there are these officers that are as good, if not better, tactically, strategically, perhaps politically, not the loose cannon that sometimes Custer is perceived to be, but they just don't have that star quality that Custer had. They don't have
pizzazz.
The pizzazz, the elan, the cavalier and buckskin, as I said, that Utley describes him, rightly so, and that incredible Elizabeth Custer, who helped stockpile all these incredible stories that he could do no wrong. And let's face it, he was no saint. He was a womanizer who did a lot of other things, but that all was put aside. And for years, she professionally went out there as the dutiful widow and kept that story of her husband, good, bad, or indifferent, real or not, alive for many, many generations. And going back to what we had talked about, that mystery of what happens in that, as one of the Indian informants says, the battle only took as long as it takes a hungry man to eat his lunch, so to speak. It's a quick battle. It's the quickest battle on record in many respects, except for the 7 Days War, which would have been 3 days if Moshe Dayan had the patch on the right eye, but he didn't, I guess. So, but it's a quick battle, and yet Chris's point is the salient one. You can probably go anywhere and up to a certain generation. If they're 20-somethings or something, no, perhaps not. But everybody over 30 or so will know, except for Chris's daughter and mine, because they've been exposed to all this, and our children but can't wait to get out of the house and away from us. So
yeah, right there with you. So listen, you've been talking about Rosebud so much, people probably think we're talking about Citizen Kane and Orson Welles and
Isn't
such.
that Orson Welles on the drinking right now?
And so I'm going to leap into the breach like Henry V here, because I have my great grandfather was at the Battle of Rosebud under General Crook.
Was he in the Ghost Army?
There's a Ghost Army connection to the 7th Cavalry, Chris, and I know for those of you playing the Ghost Army drinking game, we'll get back to that later on. But His name was William Colcroft, and he was a 38-year-old private in Company C of the 9th Infantry. And he had been, Chris, you'll be happy to know, earlier in his military career, he'd been a sergeant for the 62nd Regiment of the British Army.
I am happy to hear that.
Serving in Ireland, where he met a lovely Irish Catholic girl and married her. And then somehow he ends up in the United States. My theory is that he deserted from the British Army, but I don't know that for sure. But he ends up in the 9th Infantry under Crook. He is at the Battle of Rosebud. You can look him up. He's in the rosters, etc. And then 2 years later, and we do know this for sure, he deserts from the United States Army. So it's possible that my glorious ancestor deserted from both the British Army and the U.S. Army. I certainly hope
He'll get it right eventually. He'll find the one he wants.
He's just he's not ready to sacrifice his freedom for anything. So
hey, Rick, just so you know, going to tie in your Rev War trip. The 62nd is one of the regiments with Burgoyne.
Oh, okay. Making a note of that here. But so
Rick, I'm noticing some of the comments are rather interesting in the live comment column. Do you want to? There's a few of them there from Debbie, for instance, about a story from her.
Sure. So Debbie has a family story too. Since obviously mine wasn't enough to hold your interest, let's go to Debbie's.
That's what I suggested, that we go to Debbie's story. Yes,
I thought that was a very subtle move. I just wanted to point it out.
Kristen trained me well.
So Debbie Power Cepeda says, a family story for me is my great-great-grandfather was in a regiment that was assigned to bring in the dead from the battlefield, and he claims they found Custer 2 miles from the site, and they brought him back there dead. Well, hopefully he was still dead. And supposedly she had one of Custer's swords for years, but as a destitute widow, this presumably is the great-great-grandmother, as a destitute widow had to sell it. Again, myth and legend. There, how many Custer swords do you think, and Custer horses and Custer buckskins do you think there are out there?
Well, Chris personally sold me 3, so that
including that's actually Custer's uniform you're wearing, right?
I also see Libby below has an interesting comment.
Libby says, I've read that Custer attacked Indian villages when braves were out hunting, killing women and children and setting fire to the teepees. Could you speak to this aspect of military history?
That's closer to the movie myth, but when he does attack, 10 years earlier, roughly, actually about 8 years earlier, he's in Oklahoma, I guess not for a football game, but going down to the Ouachita. And again, on these columns moving into, in this case, the Southern Cheyenne and such. And they do attack in the dead of winter, and they do attack the camp, but the men aren't hunting out at that time. They are actually, as they normally do during winter, they're hunkering down. So he attacks a village of men, women, and children. And yes, men, women, and children are killed in that attack. Many are taken prisoner, and Custer was fortunate in the fact that that village, once again, we all understand military intelligence and the lack thereof. Well, his military intelligence, somebody was holding out in Custer's luck, as they used to say, was definitely working that day, because there was a lot more, a larger scattered enemy force than he had thought of. And they did kill the horses. Why they do that is one thing. The horse to the Plains Indians, whether they're Southern or Northern Plains, is like taking away Patton's tanks. Now you have a bunch of grunts with sidearms, and they don't have their Sherman tanks. But he doesn't attack. That village is not out hunting. That village is probably the largest association of Native Americans in a wartime configuration ever. We'll never know how many thousands of warriors were there. But a child, a woman in an Indian village is as much a combatant capably, if they have to be, because they're used to, again, they're not sitting at home at the fort like the soldiers' families are, such as their families were, because most enlisted men were single. So no, that's part of the myth. But you do try and attack with the surprise, but surprise was really not gained at Little Bighorn. They knew they were being stalked, and they were not out hunting and doing things. They were in camp, and they gathered Hokahay. It's a good day to die. They gathered the horses, And they went out in large numbers of very brave men who had, since the day they were almost born, were born to the horse. And many of them had been not only on hunts, but many of them had been in combat with other tribal groups, other peoples that were hereditary enemies or on and off again, because as people know, the American Indian, there's no such thing any more than there's really a European or an African or people from the Middle East. They're all various groups of people, and they have their language, their affiliations, their religious beliefs, etc. And so these guys are not caught unaware, and they're not out hunting, and they have to go out and find, oh my God, where's my best horse, and he's not painted yet, that sort of thing. So that's more of, again, the bury my heart at wounded knee situation, which was more, if you will, a cold situation. This was not a massacre on either side. This was, two combatant groups meeting, and at that day, not only did they have the superior numbers in the camp, but they certainly had the superior will to retaliate or to repulse this attack. And arguably, there were more experienced veterans on that side of the camp than there were in Custer's group.
But I'm going to just jump in again, and Chris, I'll just make a quick comment and hand it back over to you for a question. But John, you mentioned that for the women in the Native American camp, that they are much more closely involved, sort of in the fight battle support, if you will. And one of the things that I loved and discovered doing research for the interview with you, because I know it may not seem so from my questions, but I did spend 8 or 10 minutes doing some research, is that the Indian name for the Battle of Rosebud is the battle where the girl saved her brother.
Yes. This is somewhat of an anomaly, like Kathy Williams, the so-called Buffalo Soldier, who was the one woman who actually was in the post-Civil War Army in one of the black regiments. But some of the women really, these are not wallflowers. These women have lived difficult lives, and they're not pristine, having their hair done, and they're not worrying about what Goody's magazine is saying about this year's fashion out of Paris. They realize that they can be casualties, and certainly they've known, through oral traditions and things about Monacita supposedly, or at least the types of things what they can expect from these soldiers, and or what they can expect from fellow native peoples who might come and raid or attack their village or what have you. And we'll leave that one for another time. That in itself, Hollywood in its infinite wisdom has made all these bad films. My master's thesis, which is behind me, a book called Custer, the Man, the Myth, and the Movies, that came out years ago by Stackpole. Dreadful book. I fell asleep reading it 3 times. And so there we go. At any rate,
you're amazing self-promoter there. I want to just say.
And it's not a print, so I don't get a nickel, so it doesn't really matter. It's again, I told you they get remaindered before they come off the press. But having said that, they make all these dreadful films, and yet that particular Rosebud, battle, the story and its name, would be an incredible way to look at a topic that's normally been looked at through the eyes of old white guys like me. And that's not the best way to approach history in a more rounded sense. And so that's why I'm hoping, self-promoting in this case, that this tour will allow us to have a deeper and broader vision of those people who are attacked that day and those people who do attack. They're all human beings. And the right and the wrong of it is one thing, but the fact that that day many people died or suffered tremendously at that one afternoon. And of course, in Custer's case, it's like, thank God he had New York Life, because he and Sarah, and he literally did. It was one of those things where they finally said, maybe we should write in the war clause into insurance now, because it's not a good thing to give people insurance to go to battle, But a lot of his family dies there, whether they're immediate family blood relations, like his brother Tom, who was a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient, or whether they're, the in-laws who married into Custer's court, because Custer it was kind of like a feudal lord. He picked and chose his guys like Benteen, you go over to this fort, my guys will stay at my fort, and we'll have a great life, standing around the piano singing Gary Owen or whatever they are going to do over the winter months. So in this particular case, that battle is going to be, I never made it there in my entire life until, thank God, Yakir took me out this back road that we could barely get around in a 4-wheel drive vehicle from. But it's It's nothing spectacular, but it shows the tenacity of both sides, and this story of the sister who comes out to rescue her brother. That's about as personal as you'll ever get. I know my sister would never rescue me from anything, but then again, she wasn't.
My sister, I think, is watching, so she can comment as to whether she would rescue me in that situation or not, and I'll believe whatever she says. And yeah, and she actually put a comment up here. She says, "Is John doing a tour? Has that been mentioned?" And that is my sister, and I honor her by putting her comment on the screen. And John, you, if it were not for the current situation, you would be out on your tour or close to leaving for it.
Right, we would have been leaving. It was set up. The folks at headquarters are really smart. I know that doesn't always happen in the military, but in the case of Stephen AMbrose, we were actually going to be at Little Bighorn on the day of the reenactment, which was, what, the 173rd or whatever, 170th reenactment. So pray that next year all this is over and we hopefully make the cycle at that time in June 2021. But the tour will not only encompass looking at Little Bighorn, but we're going all the way back to pre-Treaty of Laramie of 1868 to the Groton fight, which is kind of the beginning in some historians' minds, and I think probably rightly so, the long, ill-fated wars with the Plains Indian people, particularly the Lakota, the so-called Sioux. And we actually are staying overnight at Fort Robinson, where tragically Crazy Horse is killed by another American Indian, not even soldiers. And we're doing the Rosebud, and we're doing an aside trip to the spectacular area that Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce people came through during that campaign that immediately follows on the 1876-77 campaign with the Lakota and with the Cheyenne and others. And so the countryside is unbelievable. And again, when you appreciate how incredibly how the terrain, the topography influences what happens there, and the lack of knowledge in many respects of that terrain and topography, and the vast distances. Normandy is fantastic, but it's pretty focused. You can eat from one end of Normandy to the other and hit most of the restaurants in the Magic, which I tried to do. And next time I'm home, Chris, I want you to do that with me. But it's and they didn't have the aerial reconnaissance, all these things. And when you go there and it's the proverbial boots on the ground, you say, okay, I may not be a Custer-phile, but I understand certain elements of what happened that day. And I can appreciate more when we are on the ground and why we don't know exactly what happened. And coming back to your question, Rick, why the archaeology has helped us unravel some of the mysteries, but not all.
So can I squeeze in one question? I know we're getting close. No.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
We talked a lot about Custer and the Plains Army, and I'm just curious, and this is probably too big a question, but why don't the Indians get it together? I mean, Crazy Horse is an amazing battlefield commander. They can clearly see, the big blue engine that could coming towards them. They score some really notable successes and individual things, but they just never seem to get their act together to really deal with this threat. And I just kind of curious how.
Rosebud is about the only time that they do get it together, and by that Little Bighorn, greasy grass, somewhat by accident. But it's a tribal community. There is, again, as we said earlier on, there's no such thing as an American Indian. Even within the greater circle of the Lakota or an Apache, you have other Apaches, going out after fellow Apaches. Well, there's no such real thing as an Apache either. These are clan-based people, tribal-based people, people who don't have that, not like the Iroquois Federation, which was kind of an anomaly to the native peoples, but it's the same way in the tribal peoples of Europe. A Frenchman is, in the days of when the Romans arrived, there's no such thing as a Frenchman. They're all these tribal people, the Gauls, and the same way in the Britons, my God. So these are tribal people that have never moved on because they haven't had to. Unfortunately, the time they learn too late, and by that time they're overpowered by the technology and the sheer numbers. But it's a very cultural thing, and if you look at who they are and how they had lived for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years as hunter-gatherers, and some of them are agriculturists. But they're as diverse as going to Africa or to Europe or to Asia. There is as many diverse people here, and that's what's hard for people who have not, when they look at things, there is no such thing as an American Indian. There are all these rich cultural layers, and sometimes they're allies, sometimes they're enemies, but getting them together is like making the United Nations work really today. Does it really work?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I used to work at Plymouth Plantation, we would talk a lot about the Native Americans there and allowing the Pilgrims to come. And that story of the first Thanksgiving and the Native Americans helping the Pilgrims. Well, the reason they were doing that is they were trying to convince the Pilgrims to help them beat up on another group of Native Americans.
Precisely, and the use of Native peoples on either side, whether it's the French or the British or the English or the later colonials who become the Americans. A colleague of mine, Jonathan Deese, who's a friend of mine, who's working heavily on the next couple of books I'm doing. He's writing a masterful work on the use of Native peoples by those various colonial entities in North America. So up in New France and in the New England area or what have you, and they're doing so because they're utilizing the British as much as the British or the French are utilizing them against their traditional enemies. And one of my favorites is still Rogers Rangers. There's a couple of guys who are based on real characters who are with Spencer Tracy, who are American Indians, going into Canada against those other Indians, because there's no such thing as an Indian. They are guys, as my grandfather said, who lived out there, but whatever.
Lived out there.
Yeah. Well, you're French Canadian. He talked very funny. So.
I understand. Yes.
Well, I found out the other day when I was out on a bike ride that I live near a battlefield 0.2 of a mile from my apartment building on South Michigan Avenue. It's what's called the Battle of Fort Dearborn. Mm-hmm. It's a dog park now, I think, mostly surrounded by apartment buildings. I don't think there's much to be gained by checking out the terrain or bringing a tour there. But what was interesting to me is that the historical marker on that site calls it the Battle of Fort Dearborn. That marker was put up about 10 years ago, maybe. And up to that time, I had always ever heard it referred to as the Fort Dearborn Massacre. So the interpretation is changing, as we speak, and of course trying to have an understanding of both sides. And it sounds like that's what's happening as well with the Battle of Little Bighorn.
And rightly so. And again, hopefully we can provide enough information that people can make some of their own decisions. The saying used to be, when the white guys were wiped out, it was a massacre. When the Indians were killed, it was a victory. So we have to get beyond that.
So I know that Chris would be super disappointed if I didn't come up with a connection between the 7th Cavalry and the Ghost Army.
There we go. Here we go. Drum roll.
So I want to mention that the commander of the Special Plans Branch for the 12th U.S. Army Group in World War II was Colonel Billy Harris. And so this was the Special Plans Branch coordinated the activities of the Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. And during the Korean War, Billy Harris was the commander of the 7th Cavalry.
Oh, you pulled that out. Oh,
I know. And he actually put a saddle on his Jeep. It's fairly famous among, people interested in that sort of thing. And, he was sort of trying to draw on the spirit of Custer and the Plains Wars. And when I talk about Billy Harris and mention that, I always say he must have done a better job than Custer did, because he didn't actually lose his entire command.
That whole thing about the saddle, I wish you wouldn't have brought up, because I think Eric Flint now is going to go out and put one on his car.
Hey, Doreen, I saw a comment from Doreen. She's looking forward to joining us next year. Hopefully, John owes me a trip, so hopefully I'll be on there with you. But Doreen, we've decided that you're going to wear the Libby Custer hat for the tour, so be ready.
Yes, and I also, regarding my sister, has said that it's up to me to rescue her. So I guess we know how that goes down. But all right, I'm pushing buttons over here. It doesn't always do what I want to do. Yeah, I know. So, John, thank you so much
Thank you,
for
John.
joining us today. Absolutely fabulous. And I know everybody is getting ready for that tour next year. And if Chris can't make it and you need a wingman, I'm happy to serve. And I am very good at that. Just let me see. We'll talk about it offline.
Somebody competent with me. Thank you.
Well, if you can't find a competent person, one of us will handle it. So thank you so much for joining us, and
Thank you, John. It was wonderful to see you again.
Please do let us send us an email with the reading list, and we'll add it to the History Happy Hour reading list on the website. We're a couple of weeks behind. We're going to catch that up on Monday. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
I've removed him from the stream, but don't forget, he can still hear us. And we can see him even though everybody else can't. So he's just trying to, oh my God, why is he doing that? So Chris, what's up next week? What are we doing next week?
So we're really I think will be very interesting. We have Eric Flint, who many of you may know. He is one of the
putting a saddle on his car right now, isn't he?
He's putting a saddle on his car, and beyond that, he is one of the Stephen AMbrose historians, and more importantly, he is the head of the Fort Lewis Army Museum. And what he's going to be talking about is being a combat historian. During the Gulf War, Eric was actually sent as an Army officer to be a historian, and he's going to talk about his experiences during that. And the craft of being a historian and how it's a little bit different under combat conditions than it is for Rick and I in a living room. So
I imagine so.
Yeah, so it should be a really fascinating insight into the historical craft and the American Army today, and hopefully I think it'll be very interesting.
Excellent. And of course the show's not over until we play the epic History Happy Hour close. So
cool. Can't wait.
Chris, it's been great being with you. And everybody who's been watching, thank you so much. And all of our shows are archived on the Stephen AMbrose Historical Tours YouTube page. So you can go back and find out why Andrew Roberts is such a fan of Red Bull, or all the interesting things Joe Balkowski said about the 29th Division, and all of the lame jokes Chris and I have told each other. So Chris, thank you so much.
Yep. And also, please, if another question comes to you through the week or something else you're wondering about or things you'd like to hear, please send us an email because we've got time to answer them.
Yes, and we've got nothing but time. And the email is hhh at Stephen AMbrose Historical Tour. I'm sorry. Try again, Rick. hhh at StephenAmbrosetours.com.
Thanks, guys.